And this was just moments ago. If you missed it live, this is what we were watching. Really beautiful ceremonies, sad, somber, but really just gorgeous ceremonies. These funerals in the morning for presidents that have passed. This is what we watched just moments ago. As the and you know what? We'll allow you, in case you missed it, to listen in again.
Scripted this in advance, consulting his family. This is what presidents do unless they're shut down in office or something untoward happens. And we will be seeing things as he wanted us to see them.
Julian Zelizer also joining us, a history professor from Watertown, Massachusetts. Thank you so much for your time as well, Professor Zelizer. We appreciate it. As we watch the pictures from Palm Desert, California, this is a process of extreme precision and exactitude. Tell our viewers exactly how much planning goes into presidential state funerals. Mr. Zelizer? Let's turn back to Richard Schenkman in Seattle. I'm not sure about our connection with Professor Zelizer right now. Mr. Zelizer, you are with us?
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes. Are you able to hear me, Mr. Zelizer?
Yes, I can hear you just fine.
Perfect. I was curious about the precision and the planning that goes into a state funeral. Can you share some of your thoughts with us?
Yeah, these are very planned events, both from the security to the procession itself. And in this case, it's an event where the deceased president had made his intentions very clear. So these are unique moments in American history, and I think that's part of why there's so much grandeur surrounding them.
When we received word that the president had passed away, we were informed by Betty Ford herself. How typical or atypical is that?
Well, I think there's different ways in which we learn about how a president has passed away. I don't think there's a standard way, but the family is always obviously the first source of this kind of information.
Also on the line right now, we have other people who can weigh in and share their insight on the late president. We have Bill Schneider as well, who is in South Carolina, a former congressman who served and was a dear friend of Mr. Ford as well.
Yeah, Congressman Vanderjack, I believe you're still with us here. Do I have it right that the former president actually wants to hear his alma mater's fight song played from the University of Michigan?
You know, throughout his presidency, he really preferred the University of Michigan fight song to Hail to the Chief.
Now, can we certainly can we expect this to hear it here at some point in the next few days?
At some point in these ceremonies, you can be absolutely sure that you'll hear Hail to the Victors.
I think we can, and at least they're shaped to be the kind of recollection that presidents want to have. It's the final view of a president, his passing, and they are really crafted in the way that the president would like to be remembered.
We're now going back to live pictures now at the ceremony, I believe, at the Palm Springs Airport. This is where the casket is expected to arrive any moment, in just a few minutes. Another ceremony to take place there before the casket that is carrying the body of former President Gerald Ford will be loaded onto that plane and then flown back to Andrews Air Force Base, and then make the drive to Washington, D.C. and the nation's capital. The Capitol building, where he will lie in state at the Capitol Rotunda. That casket will make stops at the U.S. House of Representatives, where he spent so many years, also at the U.S. Senate, where also he was spent time, of course, as Vice President. That meant he was the President of the Senate, to honor his service there as well. But we will continue to watch these live pictures and bring you more of this ceremony as we see it throughout the next hour. Again, another live picture here at the departure ceremony happening for Gerald R. Ford. The casket carrying his body is set to arrive any minute at the Palm Springs Regional Airport. At that point, it'll be loaded on one of the Air Force One fleet of airplanes, jets, and then flown back to Washington, D.C. for the where he'll lie in state at the state capitol, or rather at the nation's capital. And of course, funeral services and ceremonies will take place over the next several days, including the national memorial at the National Cathedral there in D.C. on Tuesday. But again, we're keeping an eye on the live picture at the Palm Springs Regional Airport, where just a short time ago we actually saw the casket leave the church. It is on its way en route to that airport. When we see it arrive and the ceremony begin there, we will take you back to it.
Thousands are paying their final respects to former President Gerald Ford. This took place in Palm Desert, California. Now his body is being flown to Washington today, where it will lie in the state capitol in the rotunda. You are looking at a live picture of Palm Springs International Airport. We are waiting for the departure ceremony to take place. Again, these are live pictures. There you see the Army, Marine Corps, Navy, Air Force, and Coast Guard troops involved in this important departure ceremony. When it gets underway, don't worry, we'll bring you the live pictures from California. We have grown to know the Ford family, and certainly Betty Ford and Mr. Ford himself, as such a team. Mr. Shankman, tell us about their deep love and their affection for each other.
And in the 1970s, suddenly a president's family became front page news. Betty Ford was constantly overshadowing her husband, the president, by various things that were happening to her, either alcohol as a problem, or breast cancer, or her vociferous backing of the Equal Rights Amendment for women. And what you had happen here was a lot of politicians being caught unawares. They didn't realize that all of a sudden they had to deal with their family as a political issue. And the Fords were really the first presidential family to have to do this. Now it's commonplace to think of presidents' families as being the subject of news stories. It wasn't back then. This is all part of the fallout from the 60s, where the personal was political. Now what we had was a first lady whose politics suddenly and her personal lifestyle became political fodder for opponents. She was a very controversial first lady, and in some ways that created a problem for her husband, because what happened was she sometimes seemed to overshadow him. And back then it was regarded as a strong woman meant that the husband had to be weak and ineffectual. Of course, it wasn't true in this family's case, but that was the perception, and Gerald Ford struggled with that. At the same time, they were a very loving family. They were a very American family. You had 4 children, one of whom was a park ranger, another was a divinity student, another a high school student. Americans could identify with the family, at the same time that they were often troubled by some of the things they were learning about the family, about the fact that this was, as Betty Ford said, while we're a regular traditional American family, there were kind of the 60s themes that were seeping into the news accounts of the family. Most famously in the 60 Minutes interview with Betty Ford, when she was asked by Morley Safer what if her daughter came in and said that she wanted to have an affair with somebody, and Betty responds by saying, well, they're normal, she's a normal girl, and what happens, I'll support her.
Wow.
This is something that's worth remembering about this family. They were the first presidential family to have to deal with kind of the fallout from the 60s.
Richard Shankman, thank you for your perspective.
And Bill Schneider, we'll pick up on that that aspect of presidential families. Did they, Bill Schneider, did they certainly set the tone? This family, did they change at all? And we see presidential families certainly differently since the Ford family.
That's right. Betty Ford was, in fact, politically influential because of her views on a lot of social issues, on women's issues, as well as her efforts to destigmatize problems like cancer, breast cancer, which she suffered from, and alcoholism, addiction. She made a serious effort, and I think made a big difference in this country in destigmatizing those problems, and that was a very forthright stand and something no one expected from a First Lady, and was one of the enduring legacies, really, of the Ford family on the country.
And Bill, do we know if that, I'm sure maybe that may have given some of the president's staff fits, given the White House fits, but did that bother the president himself? Did that bother President Ford that much, that his wife was getting involved?
I don't think so. There is no evidence to that effect. He always was supportive of her, proud of his family, and there was never any indication that if it was a political problem that it really hurt him. There were, of course, some of those who challenged him, who thought his wife was too outspoken, but on his part, he was always deeply supportive of his wife, as she was always of him.
Speaking of being outspoken, let's talk about the interview with Bob Woodward that became news recently. The interview that was granted to Bob Woodward, in which Mr. Ford was very outspoken about his thoughts on the war in Iraq and the decision to go invade Iraq. History professor Julian Zelizer, what are your thoughts on that interview and exactly the message he was trying to send the American public and the Republican Party?
I don't think it was a very surprising interview. After all, when President Ford was president, his main policy and foreign policy was détente, meaning easing relations with your adversaries, meaning avoiding excessively aggressive military action. So the fact that he would not probably support the war in Iraq, which represents the rightward drift of the Republican Party, is not surprising. So I think it reflects his moderation. It reflects a lost style of Republican politics where he was really one of the last voices of moderation in the GOP.
We're keeping an eye here on the ceremony. We're listening in. We expect the Marine Corps band to fire up again shortly, and when we do hear that, we will listen in. But again, the hearse carrying the casket of the former President Gerald Ford arriving at the Palm Springs Regional Airport. From there, it's going to make the trip over to Washington, D.C. And we have here with us as well Congressman Guy Vanderjagt, who spent years, decades, I could say, Congressman Vanderjagt, with the former president in Congress. And you talked earlier about when he was vice president. He told you, don't you dare call me Mr. Vice President, but did you see much of a change in your dear friend after spending 20-something years in Congress with him, and then when he got to the White House? Did you see his personality change, or his priorities change, or anything like that?
He remained the same person who had brought those values of Western Michigan with him. He changed the White House.
And here we go, Congressman Vanderjagt. We're going to listen in here for a moment.
The White House.
Watching today's live departure ceremony from the Palm Springs International Airport. The Army, Marine Corps, Air Force, Coast Guard, and of course Navy represented. Of course, Mr. Ford served during World War II in the Navy. And when the motorcade reaches Washington, D.C. later today, it will make a stop in front of the World War II Memorial in Washington.
And we were talking to Congressman Guy Vanderjack. We stopped there for a moment when we heard the music playing, but you were talking about how he didn't change much when he went from the Houses of Congress to the White House.
No.
Said he changed the White House. The White House didn't change him.
That's exactly the way it was. He changed the White House from that imperialism, that pomp and ceremony, into something that was down to earth. But the White House did not change him. He remained the same decent, common, sincere person he was when he walked into the office.
All right, we're going to listen in once again as the casket is removed from the hearse.
After lying in repose at the church, St. Margaret's Episcopal Church, for the last couple of days in California, the body of the 38th President of the United States is now being transported to Washington. The journey will, of course, take the President to Washington and then eventually to Grand Rapids, Michigan, where the President will be interred. Earlier, we were talking to our political experts who have joined us. Thank you so much for joining us this hour. Also wanted to talk to historian Richard Schenkman about the funeral itself and just about how important it is and how it affects the American psyche.
Well, it is important. You know, this isn't a Republican funeral, it's not a Democratic funeral, it's an American funeral. And these funerals serve a function in a divided country like America. America is always divided by politics. It's been particularly divided over the last few years. These funerals serve a vital democratic function in giving us symbols that we can rally around. Whether you're a Democrat, whether you're a Republican, for the Iraq War or against the Iraq War. You watch this event, you can't help but feel patriotic feelings about your country and respect for the office of the presidency, respect for the symbols of America, and I think that's worth remembering.
And again, we've been so happy to have with us here former Congressman Guy Vanderjagt, who spent really decades with Representative Ford in the U.S. Been watching this with us. And I guess you can't talk about the Ford presidency and the legacy without having to mention Watergate and mention the pardon of Nixon. But, you know, as such a close friend of his, do you just hate to hear that talk right now at this time? That's kind of the bad mark, I guess. A lot of people, he was criticized for that move to pardon Nixon. But at a time like this, just as a friend, I'm sure you know as a politician and as a congressman that, you know, that stuff has to be talked about. But just as a good friend of his, do you just hate to hear that talk at this time?
Because he was a good friend, TJ. Anything that hurts him hurts me. But I really don't think Watergate and the pardon hurt him. For one thing, he had absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with Watergate. And the pardon, I think history, in looking back, has come to the conclusion that it was the right thing to do to get Watergate behind us and to put our long national nightmare behind us and to move on to the many challenges that confronted us at that time: Vietnam, the economy, and the energy crisis.
As we learn more and reflect more on Mrs. Ford's legacy, let's also talk about President Ford's legacy. As we've stated earlier in the day, he never expressed any interest in becoming president. His highest ambitions were to be possibly Speaker of the House.
All right, and we still have our Bill Schneider here with us, and I want to talk to you about a couple of names from the Ford administration we saw in the current administration. Cheney and Rumsfeld, they played a role here with Gerald Ford. Talk about the role they played there, and I don't know what they might have learned back then that's still with them now.
Well, it puts an ache in my heart when I see how it is now with the bitter partisanship. It isn't like the days when Jerry Ford and Tip O'Neill could battle it out on the floor of the House and then go off the next day and have a golf game together. The kind of person that Ford was had a lot to do with setting the tone of bipartisanship, and though you had aggressors, you didn't have enemies.
And with that pardon, it certainly affected the presidency and the president's approval rating at the time, plunging from some 71% to 50%. So my question, Mr. Schenkman, is how has history therefore treated his reputation from the 70s until today?
Well, he looks a lot better today than he did 30 years ago. And one of the reasons is that historians like to give presidents credit when they lead public opinion. We give them a lot of credit when they take public opinion in a direction that they think the public needs to go in, but is not quite ready for. And that's what Ford did with the Nixon pardon. I think that he bungled the introduction of the pardon, the way that he sprang it on the country without advance notice. I think that hurt him, and I don't think that helped the country at all. I think he could have handled that better. But his act of doing it, that goes over well with historians, because it was one way of trying to put Watergate behind us so that we wouldn't, as Nixon said, wallow in Watergate, because we still were wallowing in Watergate. And there was so much on the national agenda that we had to get to that really somehow had to be figured out to put this behind us so that we could move forward.
All right, I want to remind our viewers what we're seeing here. We are watching the plane, one of the Air Force One presidential fleet, that will take the body of Gerald Ford out of California for the last time. Leaving, heading to Washington, D.C. for a few days of memorials and celebrations of his life, his presidency, before his funeral at the National Cathedral on Wednesday, and then he'll be heading to Michigan to be buried. Our Bill Schneider is still with us here. And Bill, could this serve, again, our political analyst, Bill Schneider, can this serve the death of Gerald Ford as a reminder of how things used to be? This was a different era. He was from a different era. When, like we've been saying, they could fight like dogs during the day, but go have a beer together at night. And there's bitter partisanship now. Could this do some good, do you think, possibly, if we all just stopped and remembered how things used to be?
I think that's exactly why there's such a wave of nostalgia accompanying the passing of Gerald Ford, the funeral of Gerald Ford. It's a nostalgia and also a longing for a lost political style. Mr. Schenkman mentioned a minute ago the lost style of the Republican Party, of moderation. These days, the moderates in the Republican Party have largely been defeated, left the party, retired from politics, and a far more aggressive style of movement conservatism, which came in with Ronald Reagan and has now reached the crescendo with George W. Bush, has taken over. And it has, in its way, created this bitter style of partisanship. Of course, both President Clinton and George W. Bush were seen as very divisive presidents. Americans long for the moderation, the pragmatism, the ability to work with people across the aisle of a Gerald Ford. If you remember, when George W. Bush first ran for president he declared in 1999, he promised to be, quote, a unifier, not a divider. And that was what a lot of people longed for in this president. A compassionate conservative, he called himself. Many Americans have been disappointed that his style has been more harsh, more divisive than they expected it to be, and they want to recover that. That's, I think, why there's so much nostalgia and a renewed sense of hope, perhaps, that this style of politics can be recovered. Well,
Bill, given everything you've just said, that lost political style and the increasing large pool of Republicans and Democrats eyeing the White House in 2008, what can they learn?
What they can learn is that there is a political reward for unifying the country, not just playing to the base. The base style associated with Karl Rove, President Bush's political advisor, has now become very much of the moment. It's considered the growing political tendency.
And I think proof of the pudding is Jimmy Carter and Jerry Ford became good friends afterwards.
And here we are watching the plane take off right now. Gerald Ford, the 38th president of the U.S., is now leaving California for the last time.
Mrs. Ford, members of the Ford family, President and Mrs. Bush, Vice President and Mrs. Cheney, President and Mrs. Bush, President and Mrs. Carter, President and Mrs. Clinton, distinguished guests, my fellow Americans, it's a great privilege and an honor for me to be here. For the past week, we have been hearing the familiar lyrics of the hymns to the passing of a famous man, the hosannas to his decency, his honesty, his modesty, and his steady-as-she-goes qualities. It's what we've come to expect on these occasions. But this time, there was extra value, for in the case of Gerald Ford, these lyrics have the added virtue of being true. As a journalist, I was especially grateful for his appreciation of our role, even when we challenged his policies and taxed his patience with our constant presence and persistence. Citizen Ford knew that he was not perfect, just as he knew he was not perfect when he left, but what president ever was. But he was prepared because he had served his country every day of his adult life, and he left the Oval Office a much better place. The personal rewards of his citizenship and his presidency were far richer than he had anticipated in every sense of the phrase.
According to an ancient tradition, God preserves humanity despite its many transgressions, because at any one period there exist 10 just individuals who, without being aware of their role, redeem mankind. Gerald Ford was such a man, propelled into the presidency by a sequence of unpredictable events. He did his duty as a leader, not as a performer playing to the gallery. In recent days, the deserved commentary on Gerald Ford's character has sometimes obscured how sweeping and lasting were his achievements. Gerald Ford's prudence and common sense kept ethnic conflicts in Cyprus and Lebanon from spiraling into regional war.
Currently, the motorcade, including the hearse bearing the casket of President Ford, on its way to the Gerald R. Ford Museum in Grand Rapids. It's a fairly short drive. There you see on your screen now a live picture from outside the museum. We're expecting the arrival at the museum fairly shortly. There'll be a service. This is a picture on your screen from Grand Rapids, Michigan. You can see members of the various honor guards forming up, taking their positions, the motorcade getting closer to the museum. We expect a ceremony there outdoors when the hearse arrives, and that should be momentarily. Let's watch and listen.
The psalmist wrote, "And those who know thy name put their trust in thee, for thou, O Lord, hast not forsaken those who seek thee."
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Betty, Mike, Jack, Steve, Susan, Brother Dick, members of Ford family, and friends of Ford. I do have a group here that I'm not sure are friends or family, so let them be both, and those are the groups standing behind me on the steps. That's the United States Army Chorus. And as Betty knows so well, that she and President Ford, they became her favorites in the White House, and they have been with you for so many significant events since that time. So it's only appropriate that they're here as they were for the dedication of this museum in 1981. And so the journey that started in California and went to Washington, D.C., and now nears the end in Grand Rapids, we all join and say, welcome home, Mr. President.
To Mrs. Ford and to Mike and Jack and Steve and Susan, and certainly friends of the Ford family, and to President and Mrs. Carter. As governor of this state, I know you feel it, I hope you feel it, but I can tell you, on behalf of our 10 million citizens, how proud and honored we are that you are here. And of course, to President Ford, I echo what Marty said. Welcome home. Welcome home to the city where you ate dinners with your family on Union Street, where you laughed with your high school football friends, some of whom are here, where you graduated with honors from Grand Rapids South. Mr. President, welcome home to the city and the state where your mother and your stepfather baked into your young life some good Midwestern values. Mr. President, we are proud that you have found your way home. second only to Grand Rapids. The University of Michigan shaped Gerald Ford's character and broadened his outlook. In placing a memorial wreath on behalf of the entire Wolverine family, Mary Sue Coleman expresses the university's own pride in and affection for its most distinguished graduate. In his memoirs, President Ford wrote of Yale University and its Gothic towers with unabashed enthusiasm. Everywhere I went, I observed an atmosphere of scholarship, dignity, and tradition, he said. In Yale's classroom, he mastered the law. On its athletic fields, he learned lessons that would stand him in good stead and guide him the rest of his life. Today, President Richard Levin and Yale University honor us, even as they honor this son of Michigan, who was also a loyal son of Eli.
Let us pray. Lord God Almighty, in whose name the founders of this country won liberty for themselves and for us, and lit the torch of freedom for nations then unborn, and the blessing of God Almighty, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, be among you and remain with you always.
The U.S. Air Force military band lining up outside the Gerald R. Ford Museum in Grand Rapids, Michigan, adjacent to the Grand River. A week after his passing in Rancho Mirage, California, the fourth and final memorial service for our 38th president, taking place in the area where he represented in the U.S. House from 1949 until 1973, when then Congressman Jerry Ford was elevated to vice president, and then, as you know, 10 months later, became our 38th president. For the last 17 hours, he was lying in repose. An estimated 60,000 folks from the Grand Rapids area in line all day and all night to pay their last respects to Gerald Ford. His body will now travel to the Grace Episcopal Church for a final private ceremony that you can watch live here on C-SPAN.